So we're continuing in the book of Micah. If you'd like to go ahead and open up to chapter 2, Micah chapter 2. So let's kill this mic, if you don't mind. So as we take a look at the book of Micah, we're talking about a time frame about 50 years before the fall of the northern kingdom into the hands of the Assyrians. They're going to be led off into captivity. Their main charge is the corruption of the moral society of the nation, the northern kingdom. And when we look at their challenges that they have, Micah opens up, like I said, setting up this idea of kind of like a courtroom, like a charge, a legal proceeding. And the charges have been brought before them. And so each chapter, I guess the way they divided this, remember, it wasn't divided by the actual authors, but as this is divided up, chapter 1 is the first charge, and it's directed at Samaria. And when I say Samaria and I use Israel, they're the same. So we're looking at the northern kingdom. And it reaches into Jerusalem. Remember, he never forgets, Jerusalem is right behind them when it comes to their apostasy. They're only going to get a reprieve of about 50 years before God finally says, okay, it's your turn. I've dealt with you long enough as well. And so it's directed. Chapter 2 that we're going to look at tonight describes the specific charges that God is going to bring against them and the reasons behind it. And these, to me, I think this chapter is really a great little chapter. Only 13 verses, but trust me, I can drag it out. That's a joke. So, but it's very neat because the way the charges are developed and the way it's written, we miss sometimes the amazing application that it has for us today and the challenges, and especially looking at the level in which he's bringing this charge. It's really bringing it at a national level, but it involves, so he's going to bring specifically towards him. And then chapter 3, which we'll get to next time, he specifically goes to the leadership itself. So the very first one, he talks about this woe. Now that word alone, I don't know about you, but sounds so Old Testament. Just sounds really biblical, and we don't go around and say it. We hear it. Woe to them, the scribes and Pharisees. Woe to them. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time describing and kind of making the application of why this word is so powerful, because we just don't use it in our everyday lives. The word woe, and he starts it out in the very first, is woe to those who devise wickedness and work evil on their beds. When the morning dawns, they perform it because it is in the power of their hand. They covet fields, they seize them and the houses, and they take them away. They oppress a man and his house. Now, Hebrew poetry is in this, and it's hard for us because I don't know, I'm not a poet. I appreciate some poetry, but then when you get to Hebrew poetry, you got to really kind of understand the way they write. But there's also this sense of what they call parallelism. So there's things that are running parallel with it. It's kind of like a double-lane highway. So one message is running along that's outright in the words itself, but there's also a parallel. There's something else that is being applied. A lot of times you hear it as like the shadowing. I'll say that a lot of times, where it's a shadow of some deeper meaning. So that's something that is where it really becomes rich. You can read the words and go, okay, yeah, I can grasp some of this. But that parallel interpretation that goes along with this, and it's not that it's apocryphal. It's not hidden. It's hidden to us because we're not Hebrews. We're not Hebrew readers. Somebody who was listening to this message or read this later on would see that parallelism and go, wow, and see the direct words and what they're saying, but also see this parallel message that's being said. And that's what we see a lot in this chapter. But that word woe, it is an exclamation of grief. It is an expression of lamentations or mournfulness, an exaggeration, distress towards it. Somebody's woes. When you say that, somebody has a woe, and it's something that's terrible that has happened, something very emotional that has impacted somebody. They've experienced all these woes in their life. On top of their car breaking down and their wife dying and all this, he experienced so many more woes. It's It's more than just saying, it's not a warning, and it's an active. So it's something that he's telling these people that he's talking to, this deep sadness and mournfulness about this condemnation that he's bringing upon them. And that's why it is so emphatic the way he starts out and says, woe to those who devise wickedness and work evil on their beds. Now, we put this into this charge and look at this, and he says, woe to those who divide this wickedness. So what are they doing? They're devising. They're thinking upon what is going on and thinking about it. This is somebody who is sitting there going to work every day, and they're living their lives, and they're exercising this corrupt business dealings. And then they go home, and when they're laying around in their bed, they're like, how can I pay less taxes? How could I do certain ways of getting around and making more of a profit? What if I was to increase my interest rates and then charge a collection of this rate or this fee? And I'll tell you what, I feel like that when it comes to so many things, like subscriptions, little things like that on the internet, when you're doing, little subscriptions to different programs that I have. If you want this, here, pay a nickel more. And I'll tell you what, some of the social media programs and like YouTube, and I'll tell you what, I'm going to get on the Netflix wagon because, they charge you a subscription fee already, and they're making millions and millions of dollars. And then guess what? Now, and Prime is doing this too, so I'm picking on them too. And now, if you want commercial free, you can pay $4 more a month now on top of what you're already paying. So I'm already paying for Prime. But now, and I used to not get commercials. But now if I don't want commercials, I got to pay more. I'm telling you, somebody laid up at night devising that little scheme to figure out how they can make more money. Now, that's kind of what he's saying here, is that these people that have this, corrupt thinking are not only practicing it and doing it, and now, don't get me wrong, I'm not calling them evil, Netflix and all this stuff, but just to show you how people are ratcheting up methods and way they can find ways of making more money. And that's what he's saying. They're devising, they're thinking, and it's not right. When we say wicked, we somehow think of some deep evilness that's going on, that somehow this is some satanic thing going on. No, it's wrong, in other words. It's just wrong. And when it's wrong, God says it's evil. It's wicked. And they're doing this on their beds while they come home, and when the morning dawns, this is what I love. This is where we start to see some parallelism. When the morning dawns, they perform it. So they wake up in the morning and they go, let's charge them to not have commercials. You know how many millions of dollars we can make more? And he says, why though? See, it's more than just saying you can lay around and you can have these little schemes you work up, but can you implement them? I mean, I could come up with a lot of ways that I think I can make, but if I don't have the ability. And then he says, because it is in the power of their hand. Now, this is where it's fascinating because, first off, this idea of the power in their hand is dealing with the idea of their gods. There's a parallelism in here because, remember, even with Hosea, when he was talking about the harlot wife that he had, that she was going off and she was enjoying all this prosperity, but yet God was saying she's giving credit to the Baals when it was him that was giving it to her. And so they're looking at this power that they have in their hand, and what can you do with most of your little idols? In your hand. But there's also this parallelism in the sense that they have the power and the ability to do it. They're not just somebody who's talking about it, but they can perform it. They have it, and they have the power. So what are they doing? They're coveting. He says they covet fields and they seize them. This is like that corrupt real estate agent, or tycoon who is looking at land and trying to buy more. Like when we see sometimes, corrupt governments who are looking at trying to build some mall or bring in some big industry. But you know what? There's this apartment complex that's in our way. So what do? They can come around somehow and work it and call it imminent domain. And they can condemn it and then take the land from the people. Now, I'm not saying that it's all illegal, but I'm saying that these are the type of things. What is the motive behind these things? This is the type of stuff. I could just see some politicians saying, oh, I was approached by this massive corporation and they were wanting to build this company in our town, but the only location is where this residential area is. But I can't get the land because there's people, oh, well, you know what? We'll do eminent domain. Interstate 10 came through. I don't know how many people are still around when that came through. There were a lot of homes that they came in and they declared eminent domain and they took their land from them. And they paid them, who cares? But to the person who had that house, raised their families there, was that worth it? But they had to move. I'm not saying it's illegal or such, and I don't want to go, but this is the type of social economic environment that was going on in the northern kingdom, where this type of corruption, where they're just looking at these opportunities to do what? To seize power, to take away. The sad part is, being Jews, one of the things that they should have looked at is the old law in Exodus 20:17, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. What did God say they're doing? You're coveting. He's bringing a charge against them. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, your house, the wife, the male servant, his female servant, his ox, his donkey, or anything that's your neighbor's. So they were absolutely committing a sin by going after things that wasn't their own. So it wasn't just saying, I'm doing good business, but they're actually desiring something that wasn't theirs, and then in a corrupt way, a wicked way, going about and obtaining it from them. Now, there's one very famous story that I think you remember was Ahab and Jezebel. Naboth's vineyard, remember this story? Naboth had a vineyard. Ahab wanted it. He went to Naboth and said, man, I really like your land. I'd like to have it. And he goes, no, I can't sell it because it's too much a part of my family. It's a part of my heritage. And Ahab goes home and cries to Jezebel. And in verse 7 of 2 Kings 21, Jezebel, his wife, said to him, do you now govern Israel? Arise, eat bread, and let your heart be cheerful, and I will give you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite. This is the time period, just after this time period, where the minor prophets are coming, but this has already occurred before this time when Micah is teaching, but this is the type of things that were going on. And what did Jezebel do? She set up a conniving little situation to where she had him condemned for blaspheming God and then had him killed. And then guess what? Well, the land doesn't have an owner, so they acquired the field. God never forgot that, and they repaid dearly with that. So this is what's going on. This idea of what they're doing and what they're trying to accomplish has absolutely nothing to do with taking care of people. It has to do with lining their pockets, basically. And so that's his charge to them. Verse 3, therefore, so because of these wicked schemes in which they're coming about, he says, behold, against this family I am devising disaster, from which you cannot remove your necks, and you will not walk haughtily, for it will be a time of disaster. The sad part is, in this message alone, in this one verse, it's the opposite of what God had wanted for them. He wanted to bless them. He told them, that I will bless you. And this one false concept that they had was this idea, well, we're God's people. God's not going to kick us off this land. He's not going to grow weary. And that's this counter message that Micah is coming back at them saying, no, you're wrong. But he says against his family, God's family. In other words, he's coming up with punishments, which the law had said was going to happen to them. And you're not remove your necks. And when you think about this, I thought about the time when Joshua had conquered the 5 kings, that day that the sun stood still and he pursued the kings, and he was trying to encourage the children of Israel to have courage and be courageous. And so he took those kings and he put them down in a humble position, and he told the leaders, he said, of Israel to come up and put your foot on their neck. And don't be afraid of them. Put your foot on their neck. And it was a way, not only very physically, but very psychologically. Can you imagine? You're walking up to a king, and you sit there and you put your foot on top of that man's neck. And how, if you were that man, having that foot on your neck? And I thought of this when it says this type of disaster that's placed upon their neck, like a yoke, like a foot on top of their neck. And he goes, it's not coming off. You're not going to be able to remove it. And in that sense, you're going to be extremely humbled, aren't you? He says, you shall not walk haughtily, for it is a time of disaster. This time that's going to come upon you is going to be so horrific that it's going to be humbling. It's going to be humiliating for you because you think that God's not going to do this. You think that you're blessed and privileged, but you have lost that privilege by the way that you have behaved. And in that day, so in the day that God is going to bring this calamity upon them by the Assyrian army, he says, they shall, who's this? Everybody who's watching, take up a taunt song. This is also that word taunt song. This taunt is a proverb. In some translations even say they will take up a proverb against you. And that's a wise saying. In other words, you use that as an example. We talk about Geronimo's last stand. Anybody, you hear that? What does that mean? But it has some significance. It's almost proverbial. We have these sayings that bring back a lesson, a knowledge base of what an event occurred. And he said, people are going to look at this day when God brings you down and use it as an object lesson to learn from. The one that should have been really learning that proverb was their sister in the south, Judah. That's what he's intending. Use this as a proverb. Use it as something that you can look at and learn from and don't repeat. Sometimes we forget about that, this idea of learning from those. And he said, they're going to take this up against you and moan bitterly and say, we are utterly ruined. He changes the portion of my people, how he removes it from me. To the apostate, he allots our fields. Therefore, you will have none to cast the line by lot in the assembly of the Lord. You're losing your inheritance. Basically, he's just saying the portion, whenever Joshua came in and they took the land, he, by lots, gave portions to each of the tribes. Then within that tribe, if your tribe was, Manasseh, then your tribe would then divide it down to all the heads of the family, and they would have a portion. And the way they would do it is they would cast a lot, but they would use this idea of casting a line. And they would draw the boundaries for the lots in the territory or the block or the area you as an individual member would have. And that's your inheritance. And you would pass that on generation after generation. And that was a part of God's land promise. He's going to change that. And that's a part of this taunt or this proverb that Judah should have been watching and seeing what's going to happen. That in that day, the Assyrians are going to come in, they're going to wipe you off the land, you're going to lose all of it, and there's nothing that's going to be left to pass on to generations to come. And what's even more disturbing is he's going to turn it back over to those filthy Gentiles. They're going to be on God's promised land. So that's why he's saying this should be something. So in the assembly, in other words, the brethren, the Israelites, the Hebrews, there's going to be nobody there to represent. You're not going to get this inheritance back. Now, that's a pretty negative sermon. That's something that they don't want to hear. And so that's why then Micah says, do not preach, thus they preach. One should not preach such things. Disgrace will not overtake us. That's their response. Don't preach that sermon. That's horrible. This is that entitlement. You don't say those negative things. I mean, that's like somebody preaching something in a sermon that is very negative and drawing out some negative things that maybe a group of Christians are doing and calling them on it. And them sitting there going, whoa, we're not that. No, not this church. We're fine. We're doing great. No. And so that's what he's saying. That's what they would reply with when they hear about what's going to happen to them. And so he comes back and he says, should this be said, O house of Jacob? Has the Lord grown impatient? So the questions are rhetorical. So should this be said? Of course it should be said. Absolutely. You're not, privileged. This is going to happen to you. And that's what they thought. Is the Lord grown impatient? Well, look how long he's put up with us. Look how long he's been us. We're privileged. This land is ours. He has to let us have this land. Well, the Lord has lost his patience. Now, they have also forgotten the fact that, yes, the land was promised to them, And he fulfilled that promise, and it was to be theirs forever, except until they broke the covenant. They looked at one side of the covenant promise and said, you get the land. It's your land forever. Forever. That's the way they looked at it. But they forgot the other part. That God said, the land will expel you if you break this covenant. I will take it away. And so that's kind of this thinking he's trying to bring back to them, about their words or deeds, and thinking that somehow they were immune to this permanent type of destruction. That sermon is not applicable. It's not going to happen. Why would you do that? He says, do not my words do good to him who walks uprightly? In other words, you would have nothing to worry about if you were doing right with God. You wouldn't have this problem. Don't my words do good? But you don't listen whenever his words are negative. You only want to hear the positive. That's that kind of, we just want to hear the warm and fuzzy preaching. That's what we want to hear. We want to hear good stuff. And so in 8, he says, but lately my people have risen up as an enemy. They're no longer a part of the family. They're no longer loving their brethren. They've actually turned into the enemy. You strip the rich robe from those who pass by, trustingly with no thought of war. This is where the parallelism as well happened. And it's kind of interesting because he says, lately, recently, right now, you have come up like an enemy. He's almost giving this idea of a warfare, a state of war. Now, what happened? When the army would go off to war, one of the things that they would do for the soldiers is you got paid by the pillaging. If you went into a village and they conquered it and they took it over, and there's gold and fine art or whatever it might be, that's how they got paid. And one of the imagery here is almost a slight little play on this idea of the robe. This description is one of a very costly, extravagant garment, kind of, they said, like a Babylonian level type of real beautiful garment that they would just walk up. Now, these are people that are coming through, that are having dealings with them. It's as if they'd walk up to them like they're in warfare, like they're soldiers in war, but they're not. These people would be among them, and it's like they'd come up and just strip them of this coat. Like they're in war, like they have the privilege to take this away from them. And now, if you'll recall, when Joshua came in and they started taking the land, what did Achan do? Achan hid a fine garment, and he buried it in some of the stuff he took, and he coveted. And it was during a time of war. And he says, you strip them down. And he said, those who are trusting, and they're not even you're not in a state of war, but the way your attitude is, that's how vicious that they have become. And now in 9 and 11, he gets even more personal with the charges about the family, what they're doing with the family. The women of my people you drive out from their delightful houses. From their young children you take away my splendor forever. Arise and go, for this is no place of rest, because of uncleanness that destroys with a grievous destruction. If a man should go about and utter wind and lies, saying, I will preach to you of wine and strong drink, he would be the preacher for this people. Remember, they want a wonderful message. So what is he talking about? He's talking about rampant divorce. Just putting away their wives for anything, this driving the wives out for their own benefit, their own desires, and dividing and breaking up these families. What impact does that have? Well, he says, you're taking away the splendor forever, the glory that God had established through the tribes, to the families, to the generations that would come, and the generations to come, the generations to come. His glory would continue to be reflected through that beautiful covenant relationship. They're busting it up. They're breaking and destroying the family union, and they're dividing it all up. And they're robbing others from their land, their inheritance. And so the glory's gone. A part of God's glory was the very blessings in which he had given them, and they had taken advantage of and took away from others. And so now he kind of says, it's because of this uncleanness. This is going to bring this sad, it's almost that woeful again, destruction upon them. And then he says, but if a man was to come and lie and say, hey, everything's peace, wine and utter, I like the way he says, utter wind and lies, blowing hot air. He just, that's your preacher. That's what he's saying. He goes, that's the preacher for this type of people, is the type that wants that. So now the third part, like I've said, the minor prophets always kind of keep showing God's long-term love and grace and his promise being fulfilled, even though these terrible disciplinary times are going to happen, is how the Lord is going to restore his people. Now, this is a very powerful one, and it has a couple of meanings. One very immediate to those who are going to go off into captivity and come back, but also a longer one. We either call it a shadowing or something, and it has to do with the Messiah that's to come. So 13 and 14. I will surely assemble all of you, O Jacob. I will gather the remnant of Israel. I will set them together like sheep in a fold, like a flock in its pasture, a noisy multitude of men. He who opens the breach goes up before them. They break through and pass through the gate, going out by it. Their king passes on before them. The Lord is at their head. Now, did you get that? I mean, it's kind of one of these things. It's like, well, okay, I can grab a few things out of this, when I look at it. So he's talking about bringing and reassembling them after this dispersion. And this is one that also applies to Judah, that once he's wiped them all out and starts to bring them back, but it also has something larger. So they're going off into captivity. And so if you're just superficially reading this and not grasping this messianic message, you're seeing the idea that we're going to go off into captivity, but at some point the Lord's going to bring us back and we're going to bust out of the bondage. That would be a simple way. He's going to breach through the captivity and we're going to return. But it's got the parallel message, which is much richer in dealing with the Messiah. So now when we look at this and we look at the idea of gathering the remnant of Israel, we go to what Paul describes as who is Israel. And that's what I always bring up, because everybody says, well, you got to be a Jew to be, Israel. No. Paul in Romans very clearly proves, without us going over there and doing a study in it, that those who have the faith of Abraham are of Israel. They are the ones of the promise. So what is he saying? Those who have the faith of Abraham, he shall gather. Now I'm talking about looking at the parallel message of the Messiah. So he's saying that those who are going to call, he's going to gather. Now, Jesus said, I am the good shepherd. And those who know me will come to my voice, and he will bring them in to greener pastures. This is that idea of gathering his flock. And it is the Messiah who is going to breach forward and bring forth freedom. And there's a couple ways we see this happening, but the most significant one really is the idea of the bondage of slavery, busting through that wall, that victory of defeating death and sin once and for all, and guiding us through that and defeating death. So that's the picture. Again, I looked at a lot. I listened to a Hebrew, it's called Jews for Jesus. He's somebody who believes in the Messiah. He believes Jesus is the Messiah. But then listening to him go through and his interpretation, which is amazing because of his Hebrew and pointing out some stuff about this, but because he's still very much rooted in the old law, this did not mean, and he agreed that this was messianic, but when? So it's kind of interesting how we still have to be very careful on how we go through and look. But this, most all the scholars as well, say this is a picture of the Messiah and the victory that he's going to deliver and bring the people back. So that's the chapter. That's chapter 2. Like I said, it's kind of a short chapter, but very powerful in bringing forward the charges and describing them very graphically in what they're going through. And I think if there is one big part of this I would like you to remember is this idea of you're not entitled. You're not, just because you are a Christian, you're not invincible. You don't have salvation forever. It's not a once saved, always. And that's something that is being taught, is that some are saying that once saved, always saved, and you can't lose your salvation. Well, I'd like to see that somewhere in the Old Testament, because I'll tell you what, even that's the problem that they had, that Micah's dealing with, is that they thought once they had the land, it was theirs. Once they had that privilege, it was theirs. And this chapter very distinctly says, no, you don't. No. You break the covenant and it's over. It's done. And so the same warning goes to us today as Christians, is that we should not listen to God's message and reject what we don't like to hear and want to hear that windbag who's going to sit there and make you feel comfortable, but want the honest truth. Because there's always a message of hope and opportunity to change our lives. And that's the message I want to wrap up, is that we need to think about our relationship with him, not becoming so arrogant, because God will humble us. And that graphic picture of having around your neck that something you're not going to get across and becoming a proverb to those who should learn. And that's what we should do. We should look at this chapter and learn from it and apply it, so that we're not ones who are wanting to hear nothing but good news, thinking somehow that we're going to escape judgment. Our salvation is always there. No, we have to make sure we're honest with ourselves. If you're here with us this evening and there's somebody that needs to make a correction in your lives, or you need the prayers of the church, I hope that you'll think about this message and take action. Take action before it is too late. So if you would like to, come forward while we stand and we sing.